Hello, I'm Anne Boring, head of the Women in Business chair at Sciences Po Paris, supported by AXA, and I'm assistant professor of economics at Erasmus University Rotterdam. How do we make gender inequality in the workplace a thing of the past? That's what I want to discuss in this class. Despite significant progress in the recent years, there is still a lot to be done to close the remaining gaps, especially multiple barriers to remove, so that more women can reach leadership positions in business. The good news is that we know that there are policies that are effective to achieve greater gender equality at work. Join me to discover them. Today, only 6% of CEOs of large firms worldwide are women. The gender pay gap persists at around 13% on average in the European Union and around 17% in countries like Canada, the US, and Australia. While we have made a lot of progress towards reducing gender inequalities in the labor market over the past century, these numbers show that much more remains to be done. Women are now more highly educated than men in most OECD countries, but their labor market outcomes are still worse than men's. Women's careers are still disproportionately impacted by parental responsibilities, what economists call the child penalty. And women still face stereotypes and discrimination that prevent them from reaching leadership positions, as higher-paying industries and occupations tend to remain male-dominated. Thankfully, research shows that solutions exist. I hold the Sciences Po Women in Business chair, supported by AXA, and in this class, I'll tell you how policymakers and firms can act to effectively close the remaining gaps. When we examine gender inequalities in the labor market, we look mainly at three indicators. The first one is the gender pay gap, which measures the difference between the average gross hourly earnings of working men and women. Data from statistical offices like Eurostat or the US Census Bureau show that a significant gender pay gap persists, and it has remained relatively constant or decreased only slightly over the past 20 years in many countries like the US. In France, for instance, the gender pay gap has been about 15% for the past 13 years. An important factor to understand the gender pay gap is that women and men tend to work in different occupations and industries. More specifically, women are underrepresented in occupations and industries that earn the highest wages. In France and other developed economies, this segregation explains about 15 to 20% of the gender pay gap. Some European countries have larger gender pay gaps, such as Germany at 18% or Austria at 19%, while other countries have smaller pay gaps, such as Belgium and Italy at 5%. When we look at this graph, we should be cautious, though. Having a smaller gender pay gap doesn't necessarily mean that gender inequalities have been eliminated. To understand gender inequalities, we must also consider a second indicator, which is female labor force participation. In EU countries, women's employment rate is about 10 percentage points lower than men. This lower female employment can partly explain a smaller gender pay gap in some countries. Italy, for example, has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in Europe. Italian women's employment rate is about 20 percentage points lower than men. The lower gender pay gap is therefore partly explained by the fact that it's mostly better educated women with higher earning potential who are in the labor market. And the third indicator is the number of hours worked. In many countries, women work part-time much more often than men. Throughout Europe, 28% of women work part-time versus 8% of men. When we combine these three factors that on average women earn less per hour, that they participate less in the labor market, and they work fewer hours, we get a better sense of earnings inequalities. The gender overall earnings gap is one way to measure these inequalities. It basically measures how much less women will earn on the labor market compared to men in the long run. In Italy, women earn on average 43% less than men throughout their working life. And this is higher than the EU average. At the EU level, the gender overall earnings gap is 36%. And so, while we've made progress, we can see that gender equality has not been reached. All of these factors lead to having very few women in leadership positions. Over the past 20 years, the share of women on boards of directors of large firms has drastically increased, mainly thanks to quota policies in Europe. In countries that have implemented binding gender quotas, like Norway, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, the largest listed companies have reached the 40% bar of women on their boards. However, still very few women hold leadership positions within firms. Equileap conducted research on over 3,700 of the largest publicly listed companies in the world, and it found that women account for just 6% of CEOs, 20% of executives, and 28% of senior managers. These percentages are much lower than the female workforce in these firms, which is 38%. Women's representation in leadership remains low, even though many of these large companies worldwide have implemented diversity policies since the financial crisis of 2008. At that time, many large corporations and consulting firms accelerated the implementation of policies to encourage more women to reach leadership positions, following what is called the business case argument. According to this argument, having more diversity at all ranks of a firm is good for a firm's business because having more diverse teams and leadership helps to increase creativity and innovation, reduces biases in decision-making, and helps a firm attract top talents. Is there evidence to support this argument? Recently, some researchers have identified ways to measure whether having more women in leadership causes better firm performance. For instance, two researchers studied the heavily male-dominated venture capital and entrepreneurship industry to answer the question of whether greater gender diversity leads to better organizational performance. They find that VC senior partners who have relatively more daughters tend to be less biased against women, and they hire more female investors. And when they hire more women, these firms generate better deal and fund performance. Firms are increasingly promoting more diversity in leadership. To help them achieve this goal, we need to gain a better understanding of the main persisting barriers. Gender differences take root in education. We observe that gender gaps appear as soon as men and women enter the labor market. Over the past 25 years, women have earned more higher educational degrees than men. In 2019, 51% of 25 to 34-year-old women held a higher educational degree, compared to only 39% of men on average across OECD countries. The problem is, the degrees that women earn lead them more often to worse labor market outcomes. Women are less likely to choose fields of study related to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These so-called STEM fields, however, lead to better paying jobs and career tracks. This graph for France relates the share of women earning master's degrees by field of study on the horizontal axis with the median net monthly wage earned 18 months after graduating in 2019 on the vertical axis. In fields like psychology, archaeology, and the arts, more than 70% of students are women. Earning degrees in these fields leads to lower wages, less than 1,800 euros per month. In the STEM fields, more than 70% of graduates are men, and earnings are much higher, above 2,000 euros per month. Graduates from STEM fields are also more likely to have stable jobs and to be on a better track for reaching managerial positions. Some fields are more gender diverse, such as economics and management, but in these fields too, women tend to specialize in subfields that lead to lower wages after graduation compared to men. Paradoxically, these differences in higher educational choices tend to be stronger in developed economies where men and women share equal rights. What explains this gender equality paradox? According to recent research, gender stereotypes can largely explain differences in educational choices between men and women. Indeed, researchers have found that stereotypical beliefs associating men to math are stronger in more egalitarian countries, and these stereotypes are associated with fewer women choosing STEM fields. However, in countries where this stereotype is not as strong, women are more likely to choose STEM fields. To sum up, gender differences emerge as soon as men and women enter the labor market, and as we will see, they increase drastically with parenthood. Parenthood should not be an obstacle to having a career. Yet, while parenthood has no impact on men's careers, it has negative repercussions on women's careers. Economists call this phenomenon the child penalty or the family gap. They find that the birth of a first child leads to a large decrease in women's earnings relative to their pre-birth earnings trajectory. The drop persists in the long run, leading to a 31% child penalty in the US and 44% in the UK. The magnitude of this penalty varies by country. It is smaller in countries with better access to childcare and with more egalitarian gender norms. For instance, the child penalty in Sweden is equal to 27%, and in Denmark it is equal to 21%. The penalty on women's earnings is larger in countries with worse access to childcare and with less egalitarian gender norms. In Austria, the long-run penalty is 50%, and it goes up to 60% in Germany. An important explanation for the child penalty relates to time constraints. Women are more often the primary caregivers for children, and time constraints related to childcare make women less flexible in terms of working hours. As a result, women are more likely to work part-time or to work on fixed-term contracts following childbirth. These differences in types of contracts can partly reflect women's preferences, but employer discrimination or lack of access to adequate childcare support can also strongly constrain women's choices. Following childbirth, more subtle mechanisms play a role as well. Women need to juggle work and home commitments. They thus become less mobile geographically and may prefer lower-paying jobs closer to home to avoid longer commutes to work. Finally, an important factor that contributes to the gender pay gap is that many high-paying jobs reward those who work long hours and who are available outside regular working hours. These pay incentives disproportionately penalize women and prevent them from reaching top positions. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that you are applying to jobs and you see a job posting that seems interesting to you. You apply and congratulations, you receive an offer. What are factors that you would consider when deciding whether to accept the job? Of course, the salary and the tasks that you would have to perform are crucial factors, but other factors matter as well. For instance, you may wonder, what is the work-life balance like at this firm? Are people friendly? Will I fit in? What are my chances of getting promoted? These questions relate to workplace culture. And workplace culture is a third important factor to understand why gender inequalities persist in the labor market. From research, we know that workers choose occupations where they think that they can avoid prejudice from colleagues and hostile environments. The problem is that people are more likely to face stereotypes and discrimination in environments where they are a minority. In male-dominated, high-paying industries, women continue to face stereotypes and discrimination. Importantly, we also know that exposure to sexist behaviors and sexual harassment is one reason why women exit male-dominated industries or refrain from seeking leadership positions. And yet, the risk of sexual harassment is reduced when there are more women in leadership positions. It's a bit of a catch-22. Women leave to avoid these behaviors, but as more women leave, the more these behaviors are likely to happen. Some workplace cultures also foster so-called old boys club atmospheres from which women are excluded. As a matter of fact, women may benefit from fewer promotions because they participate less in social activities organized by men in the firm. Research shows that when employees have social interactions with their managers, such as taking breaks together and chatting about non-work-related topics like their hobbies or families, they are more likely to be promoted than other employees who did not share these interactions with the same managers. A recent paper studying smoking breaks between managers and employees at a large financial institution finds that these informal social interactions could explain up to a third of the gender gap in promotions. Because of such mechanisms, retaining women in male-dominated environments is a challenge that is rarely solved spontaneously. And yet, both men and women could benefit from working in more diverse environments. Indeed, an analysis of data from the European Working Conditions Survey finds that gender diversity within job positions is correlated with higher worker well-being. So let's explore what types of policies governments and firms can implement in order to increase gender diversity. In recent years, governments in OECD countries have been increasingly implementing public policies that incentivize firms to change how they hire and promote women. We have learned that there are three main ingredients that make public policies effective. First, the policies must be binding, meaning that firms incur a penalty if they do not apply them. These costs are incentives for firms to shake up the organizational status quo and change their internal decision-making processes. For instance, if gender quota policies on boards of directors worked in countries like France and Norway, it is because large firms that did not reach at least 40% representation of women would be penalized. Countries that used a softer approach with non-binding quotas did not generate the same level of change. Second, policies that encourage transparency are effective. Take Australia. It implemented the Workplace Gender Equality Act in 2012. This act mandates businesses to submit a report including specific gender equality data. The CEO has to sign off on the report, employees and shareholders must be able to access the report, and businesses are held accountable for the progress they make within a 2-year period. As a result, many large Australian firms have substantially improved their gender equality in leadership positions. Several governments have implemented specific pay transparency policies. They mandate organizations above a given size to publish information about men's and women's salaries and bonuses. These policies have contributed to reducing the gender pay gap in countries like Canada, the UK, and Denmark. Third, family-friendly and childcare policies are crucial to reduce inequalities on the labor market. These policies are especially effective when they create incentives for men to share parental responsibilities with women. Countries like Sweden and Norway introduced use it or lose it paternity leave that requires both parents to take at least part of the parental leave. In Norway, the total parental benefit period is 49 weeks, including 15 weeks that are reserved for each parent. These weeks are lost if the father does not take them. These policies are effective because firms anticipate that both men and women will be taking time off for parental duties. They therefore reduce the relative cost for firms to hire and promote women compared to men. Governments play a crucial role in closing gender gaps through effective policies that incentivize firms. However, there are also policies that proactive firms can take on their own. What can firms do to make real progress on diversity? The main policies that firms have used until recently aimed at changing the mindsets of employees, for instance, through diversity or unconscious bias training programs. But these programs do not seem to have long-run positive effects. They can even elicit pushback from workers, especially when they are mandatory or involve a blame and shame approach. Instead, more effective policies involve changing the management systems that govern hiring and promotion decisions. One concrete way to make progress is to set internal targets for gender representation. This can be done by applying the gender proportionality principle, whereby an organization sets the goal of promoting women to the next level in proportion to their representation in the level below. To illustrate, let's say that women represent 50% of the entry level at a firm, but are only 35% at the manager level. The organization could decide to set a target of having 50% of women who get promoted to manager. This principle requires firms to think about hiring and promotion decisions at the organizational rank level rather than at the individual position level. Firms can encourage mentoring, networking, and skills training programs to reach this goal. The Behavioral Insights team, also known as the Nudge Unit, highlights other research-evaluated initiatives that firms can implement to improve gender equality in organizations. Effective policies include appointing diversity leads and/or diversity task forces, using structured interviews for recruitment and promotions, and using skill-based assessment tasks in recruitment. Transparency is also very important, especially being transparent about salaries in negotiations and being transparent about promotion, pay, and reward processes. Policies that support work-life balance through parental leave and flexible working arrangements are crucial and should be aimed at everyone within the firm. Working from home policies need to apply to both men and women to avoid situations where women would be relatively less visible at the workplace, which could harm their chances for promotion. More policies could be tested, and collaborations between firms and researchers are crucial to understand which ones are effective. Nonetheless, we have made a lot of progress in understanding what firms can do to generate more gender equality at the workplace. And actually, many of these policies are relatively easy to implement. So let's do it! Together, let's close the gender gap once and for all.